Zorlukları geçtin, yeni evine hoş geldin. Hayatın 4 mevsim, sonbahar bu kez. Başlangıcı hayallerinin. Kış günü yarının yükü omzunda, ama yalnız değilsin bu yolda. Hazırlan bir çiçek gibi açmaya, kelebek gibi kanatlanıp uçmaya. Arılar gibi çalışmak gerek bazen, sonunda kavuşmak için yaza.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to present Dr. Bruce Perry. I'm going to start with reading his short bio. May I just check something? Ben sizi duyuyorum ama aslında duymamam gerekiyor, değil mi? İki sesi duyuyorum şu anda. Şimdi tekrar bakalım. Okay. So I'm going to continue with reading Dr. Perry's short bio. I still hear you. Okay, I'm going to continue. Dr. Perry is the principal of the Neurosequential Network, senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy, and a professor adjunct in the departments of psychiatry. Okay. Şimdi teknik arkadaşlardan küçük bir destek rica edeceğim ben. Çünkü çeviriyi eş zamanlı duyuyorum. İki sesi de duyuyorum arkadaşlar. Deneyelim tekrar. Dr. Perry is the principal of the Neurosequential Network, senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy, and a professor. Peki. Şimdi küçücük bir zaman rica edeceğim. İki sesi duyuyorum arkadaşlar. Ne yapabiliriz bunun için? Yapabileceğimiz bir şey var mı? I'm sorry, Dr. Perry, because I'm also hearing the voice of the interpreter as well. And I'm just trying to keep regulated, you see, while I'm relating with you at the same time.
No problem.
Okay, let's see what's happening now. Because I just started reading your bio, but at the same time, I hear the voice of the interpreter.
I did as well.
You did as well.
I did.
Okay.
But now I don't.
Now, okay. All right. Maybe. All right. Let me go back and see what's going to happen.
Great.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Dr. Perry is the principal of the Neurosequential Network, senior fellow of the Child Trauma Academy, and a professor adjunct in the departments of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in Chicago, and the School of Allied Health College of Science, Health and Engineering, La Trobe University, Melbourne, Victoria, in Australia. Peki, sadece izleyicilerimizi haberdar ediyorum. Bir taraftan okurken eş zamanlı olarak da İngilizceyi duyuyorum. Peki. Devam edeceğim. Bakalım nasıl böyle olacak. Over the last 30 years, Dr. Perry has been an active teacher, clinician, and researcher in children's mental health and the neurosciences, holding a variety of academic positions. His work on the impact of abuse, neglect, and trauma on the developing brain has impacted clinical practice, programs, and policy across the world. Dr. Perry is the author, with Maya Slavitz, of The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, a best-selling book based on his work with maltreated children, and Born for Love, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered. Dr. Perry's most recent book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience and Healing, co-authored with Oprah Winfrey, was released in 2021. Pekala. Here again. Let's see what's going to happen. Well, Dr. Perry, good morning. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you doing? I have to say I'm very, very happy to have this opportunity.
Well, it's a great honor, Dr. Perry, because I have to say that I got deeply influenced and inspired by your work. Your emphasis on loving presence, your emphasis on connectedness, and the importance of little interactions that we have with each other, with our students, and the emphasis on one person can make a change. I've been really touched by that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and you are also now hearing the voice of the interpreter,
I am.
Dr. Perry. Right, this is a problem.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
And does the audience hear the translator?
Okay. What's interesting is that translator doesn't realize. Okay. So we need the support of our technical team now. Guys, can you hear us? It's just you and I.
We can do it. We can do it.
We can do it, definitely, definitely. We need to be flexible, huh?
So first of all, let me clarify.
Yeah.
We've got about an hour, is that right?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I would love to make sure that there's a lot of opportunity for back and forth questions and answers.
Yeah.
And
So what?
go ahead.
Yeah. I'm just going to leave the floor to you then. I'm just going to make a short announcement. Translator has started. There is a problem.
Listen, I'll just talk about my work a little bit. Let the translator talk and translate what I'm saying. It'll be slower than our usual conversation.
Yeah.
But
good idea.
It's, we'll get there.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah.
Great.
All right. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
So, as I said, I am very honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of our work. So, due to the complexities of the technology, I'm having to share some of my slides indirectly by posting them in a different monitor. And what I want you to know is that I will put together a collection of these slides and make them available by PDF after the presentation. So, first of all, again, let me just say I'm very honored to be here. I have, for many, many years, wanted to visit Turkey. And I'm hopeful that sometime in the next couple of years, I'll be able to come and in person meet some of you and share some of our work. So I'm part of a very large community of clinicians and organizations across the world. So is this better?
Sanıyorum bu şekilde devam etsek. Evet.
My interpreter wanted me to take off the headphones. So one of the things that our group has been studying is the human brain. And I hope that I'm going to just take pause. I don't hear the interpreter anymore. So I'm hoping that my pacing is adequate. So as part of our working group, apologies for all the technology glitches here. As part of our work, we have spent many years trying to understand
Biz grup olarak yıllar boyunca
how developmental experiences in utero and in the first years of life shape the biology of the brain. So part of that has involved the necessary oversimplification of some of the complexities of the human brain.
Biz çalışmalarımızda yıllar boyunca beynin biyolojisini inceledik.
So we've used a variety of techniques to try to understand how the brain works. We've used neurochemical approaches, we've used physiological approaches, we've used clinical approaches. Here's some neuroimaging. This is and I'm going to start this right here. This is a PET scan, a SPECT scan of a 5-year-old child who was significantly neglected in the first years of life. Everything that you see that is blue or red or yellow is either significantly overactive or significantly underactive compared to a neurotypical child. Part of what you may be noticing is that the abnormalities or the differences in the way this individual's brain appears to be working are all over the place. And they don't appear to be easily characterized. And so you can see that some places
kolayca karakterize edilebilmekte bu durum.
Because of this incredible complexity, the normal DSM categories that were used in psychiatry
Dolayı buradaki normal DSM kategorileri
we found to be inadequate when helping us understand children and adults impacted by trauma. So again, you probably can't read this, but what I'm trying to show here is that, excuse me, is that the brain is incredibly complex. Billions and billions of neurons, trillions of synaptic connections, and quadrillions of depolarizations. So we felt that we had to develop a new way to understand individuals. And again, don't pay attention to these slides necessarily, but the bottom line was that if you went into a typical psychiatric clinic, the children would have one of 9 different DSM labels.
Noktasına bakacak olursak psikiyatri kliniğini ele alın.
But there were thousands upon thousands of physiological routes
Açısından
to those symptoms. So we decided to develop a new approach.
ya da on binlerce fizyolojiden bahsedebiliyoruz.
And basically what we did was create
Yaklaşım geliştirmenin gerekliliğiyle anlamış olduk diyebiliriz.
an oversimplistic heuristic. It's a model of the brain
Bu noktada ne yaptık derseniz
that we use for teaching
aşırı yalınlaştırılmış bir beyin modeli oluşturduk.
and for clinical problem solving.
Bu noktada aslında öğretim için kullanabiliyoruz.
And so if you look at this image, this is an upside down triangle.
Açısından da kullanabiliyoruz.
The top of the, of this image is the top of the brain, the cortex. And the
Aslında bu aşağıdan yukarı doğru şekillendirilmiş bir üçgen. Bu şekle baktığınızda hemen aşağısında korteks yer alıyor. Burada korteksi görebiliyorsunuz.
And the bottom of the image is the brainstem. And what we're trying to show with this is the hierarchical organization of the human brain.
Görselin altında ne var peki? Beyin sistemimiz var. Bu noktada aslında göstermek istediğimiz şey temel olarak insan beyninin hiyerarşik yapılanışı, organizasyonu.
Now we know that the top part of the brain, the cortex, is the most uniquely human part of our body. And the cortex mediates these uniquely human functions. Thinking, speech and language, a sense of right and wrong. And we know that as you go lower into the brain, you get more simple regulatory functions mediated.
Daha aşağılara doğru yol aldıkça biliyoruz ki
So
daha yalın.
So we have the other thing that we know, and this will turn out to be very important in understanding the impact of trauma and neglect. We know that all of these different parts of the brain
Bildiğimiz bir diğer husus ise
and
çok önemli olduğunu belirtebiliriz. Travma etkilerini anlama hususunda beynimizin bütün bu farklı kısımları
and the rest of the body are basically connected to a set of core regulatory networks
vücudumuzun geri kalanı
that originate in the lower part of the brain.
temel olarak ortak düzenleyici ağlara bağlanmıyor durumdadır. Bunlar da beynin alt kısımlarından temelini alır, kaynağını alır.
These core regulatory networks, which include norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin,
Bu ortak düzenleyici ağlar serotonin, dopamin gibi hormonları içermektedir.
collectively reach every single part of the brain and body. In turn, we know that all incoming information
Geldikleri
from the outside world
hem beynin hem de vücudun her bir noktasına temas ederler.
and from the inside of your body
Aslında
comes into the lower parts of the brain
aktarılan her bilgi
first.
vücudumuzun içinden dışarı giden bilgiler aslında öncelikle beynimizin alt kısımlarında işlenirler. İlk buraya gelirler.
So what we experience and what happens in the brain under threat is the incoming signals mediated by what you see, smell, taste, and touch comes into the lower part of the brain
Burada deneyimlediğimiz ve altında beyinde oluşan aslında
activates
dokunma
these core regulatory networks
gibi duyular aracılığıyla beynin alt kısımlarında işlenen tepkilerdir. Tehdide karşı verilen sinyallerdir.
and then results in a cascade of changes in key parts of the brain
Aktive ederler.
to help you survive the threat.
Ve bu noktada beynin temel noktalarında katmansal değişikliklere yol açarlar. Sağ kalımla ilgili olarak bu tehdit karşısında.
And one of the primary observations is that as you become increasingly threatened, you increasingly shut down the top part of the brain.
Peki ilk elden gözlemlere baktığımızda
And the consequences of that
arttıkça
are profound.
kısmını artar bir şekilde kapatırsınız.
Now, if you go back
Ve bunun sonuçlarına gelindiğinde
and think about development, again,
geniş genel geçerli sonuçları olduğunu söyleyebiliriz.
most of you know this, but I'm going to remind you that the brain develops from the bottom up
Gelişimde düşünün.
and from the inside out.
Çoğunuz biliyorsunuz
So-
ama tekrar gösterelim. Beyin aşağıdan yukarı doğru böyle bir gelişim gösterir.
So during development,
Bir gelişimi vardır.
these core regulatory networks that are down here, they send important organizing signals to higher parts of the brain.
Ve gelişim aşamaları boyunca buradaki ortak düzenleyici ağlar önemli düzenleyici sinyaller gönderirler beynin yukarı üst kısımlarına.
And what happens if these systems are abnormally impacted by patterns of stress that are extreme or prolonged early in life?
Ve bu sistemler anormal etki altında kalırsa stres örüntüleri tarafından, modelleri tarafından
Is that you will interfere
dönem yaşantılarda bu söz konusu olursa çok güçlü etkileri söz konusu olacaktır.
So early developmental trauma creates a cascade of abnormal organizing input to higher parts of the brain.
Eğer burada erken gelişimle ilgili bir travma söz konusu olursa buradaki katmanların beynin üst bölümlerinde travma etkisiyle organize edilmesinin düzenlenmesine yol açacaktır. Olumsuz bir düzenleme ortaya çıkmış olacaktır.
So let me give you a couple of examples of how this can play out. So let me go back to this first of all. Excuse me while I search for the right images.
İki örnek vereyim. Bu nasıl meydana gelebilir? Bunu gösterelim.
So
Öncelikle kusura bakmayın tekrar öksürdüğüm için. İki görsellerimiz var burada. Onlara bir bakayım.
now, and I know most of you can't read this, but I apologize. Let me just describe this. We have an assessment process in which we look at the
Anladığınızı biliyorum çoğunlukla. Ben bunu betimlemeye çalışayım, sizlere açıklamaya çalışayım. Bir değerlendirme süreci içerisinde olduğumuz söylenebilir. Ve burada da
so we look at the nature, the timing, and the intensity of developmental trauma and resilience-related factors that counterbalance that at different times in development.
Travmanın gelişiminin yoğunluğu faktörleri farklı zamanlarda ortaya çıkabilir.
So this is a 6-year-old child. And this child had lots of adversity in the intrauterine period, early perinatal period, first year of life, and then was removed from that environment. Now, the important thing is that if you look at the way this child's brain's functioning, you see some significant abnormalities, both when you look at the functioning, but also when you look at the activity of parts of the brain. So anything that you see on these next images, these next SPECT scans, that is not gray, is at least 2 standard deviations abnormal. So I'll come back and explain what these triangular images mean in a minute. Okay. Too hard. I hope, was I going too fast? I hope not. So what I want you to sort of focus in on is just don't look at any details here. Just kind of get an image of what this looks like. And we'll take a look at another child. This is a 13-year-old child, similar early developmental trauma, similar abnormalities in parts of the brain, but different, similar, but different. And this is another child, a 13-year-old, and this is the same thing. Now, the point is that every one of these children who had developmental trauma had a different impact on how their brain organized and developed for a variety of reasons. And one of the things that we've been trying to do in our work, let me see if I can put this up here. Excuse me. One of the things that we've been trying to do is get a simple and affordable way to look at the way an individual appears to be organized, because we believe that that will help us do appropriate treatment planning to select and sequence interventions that will help the individual. And so if you recall that upside down triangle version of the brain, this is a more sophisticated example of what that is. And what we've done is created basically it's a heuristic. It's a model that helps us take functioning and then use it to reconstruct how a person's brain appears to be organized. So for example, if somebody has trouble with affect and mood, that tells us about certain systems that influence the limbic part of the brain. If they have difficulties with speech and language, that tells us a little bit about cortical parts of the brain. If they've got difficulties with temperature regulation, that tells us about the brainstem. And so we have created this process that allows us to create a heuristic of the brain. And what we've done is we've created an assessment scoring model. And I don't want to get too complicated, but basically what we've done is if an individual you're working with, no matter what their age is, has the verbal skills of a typical young adult, we give that the highest score. But if they don't have any verbal skills at all compared to an adult, we give that the lowest score. And so a newborn child is essentially going to have very low verbal skills compared to an adult. But if you look down at the lower part of the brainstem, the brainstem of an infant is more typical, is functioning much more like a typical adult. And if you look at a 1-year-old, you see something a little bit different. The brain's starting to organize. Again, as you recall, I said the brain develops from the bottom up and from the inside out. And these are our neurotypical images of the brain. Now, what we've done, because we have people all over the world, we've taught everybody, we've taught people in thousands of places to use this assessment process. And so we now have clinicians who are doing assessments of their clients using this standardized assessment process. And that has allowed us to essentially gather a tremendous amount of data about developmental experiences. And let me give you an example. This is this first panel right here is a very, very significantly neglected child who was 9 years old and developmentally was like a feral child. Very poor speech, wasn't toilet trained, was impulsive, aggressive, had no literacy, no numeracy, was a tremendous behavioral problem. And this is sort of the way a typical 9-year-old brain should look in terms of functional organization. And after putting in place a treatment plan based upon looking at this map, the child started to make improvements, and then 2 years later was significantly improved. And we've got a number of examples of things like this. The bottom line is that by looking at looking at an assessment where we're looking both at the nature and the timing of developmental adversity, and then looking at the presence of potential buffering factors, we've been able to learn a tremendous amount about what makes healthy development and what makes development become higher risk. And one of the things that we've discovered is that adversity is important, but connectedness is more important. So let me just start with this. I suspect that most people have heard about the adverse childhood experience studies. There have been hundreds of them done now, where people have looked at the correlation between adversity and outcomes. And one of the things that, this is from a paper that we published, one of the things that you can see is that the more adversity you have before you're 18, the more at risk you're going to be for any number of problems, physical health problems, mental health problems, social problems, and so forth. But one of the things, this is a very superficial perspective on the complexities of development. And so one of the things that we've started to do is look at the presence of connection to family, connection to community, connection to culture. And what we found is that if you're connected, if you have what we call relational wealth, you can have up to 4 adversities before you begin to demonstrate risk for any bad outcomes in adult life. And furthermore, even if you have none of these adversities and you have relational poverty, you're not connected well to family, you're not connected to community, you're not connected to culture, you're going to have risk for a variety of these poor outcomes related to substance use and dependence, challenges with, finishing school, difficulties with employment, a whole host of social, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive problems. Now, there are a couple things that we've tried to help emphasize in this work, and we've found it to be essential to really understanding the power of developmental experience. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. One is on the importance of the timing of an adversity. I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, that if you have a developmental adversity, it will increase your risk as you get older. But if you have a developmental adversity in the first 6 months of life versus having that very same adversity, that very same trauma when you're 16, it will have a very different impact on your brain. And so what we found is basically that the earlier you are in life, the more malleable, the more changeable the brain is. And so experiences that take place during this time are likely to have more impact. And that's both good experiences and bad experiences. And so part of what we've been trying to do for many, many years is help people in positions of policy recognize that if you invest in early childhood and invest in young families so they can create a healthy environment for their young children, that you're going to save lots of resources down the road, because you're going to help prevent help prevent morbidity and people who are entering the prison system, people who struggle with substances of abuse, people who are having a whole variety of other challenges. And so in addition to appreciating that developmental adversity in childhood impacts the development of the brain, what we've been trying to help people focus on is that the timing of developmental adversity is probably the most important variable. And then more important than that, we've been trying to help people recognize that the presence of connection, the presence of people who you can connect with, is a tremendously powerful buffer that helps minimize developmental adversity. And let me just show you. This is probably not the best slide, but if you look at the general trajectory here, and over on this axis is how well functioning is the brain. And if you look at the general trend here, so the more adversity you have, the more compromise in brain function you have. But if you look at connectedness, relational health, the exact opposite occurs. The more connected you are, the more you're protected from developmental adversity. And this, we published several things about that, about that now. And this basically is something many of you are aware of, is that you need to, rather than overemphasizing your ACEs or ACE score, you need to be aware of what the balance is between adversity and relational connectedness. So if you have high adversity and low connectedness, you're going to have a lot of global health problems. But the opposite takes place if you have connection to family, community, and culture. And this is something I think almost every good clinician has seen. This is something that's very well known to most people that have been studying, sociology. But oddly enough, this has been something that has been kind of ignored by traditional psychiatry. We've over-focused on labeling. We've over-focused on individual treatment. We've under-focused on appreciating the power of family, the power of culture, the power of community to help individuals heal. And this is something that we're continuing to do lots of work on, and the book I just published with Oprah focuses a lot on helping people recognize the power of connection and why we need to think more intently about that kind of changes in our practice, programs, and policies if we're really going to help individuals who've experienced adversity during childhood. All right. I could go on and on. I suspect that there are a lot of people that are kind of lost who don't speak English. Those of you who do speak English, hopefully this tiny little teaser about our work was of interest. I think maybe we should go ahead and do some Q&A. Might be a little bit easier. So I'm not exactly sure how. Oh, there we are. Hello.
Well, so far we haven't had a question, Dr. Perry.
Okay.
Hi. Yeah, so you can see me now, yeah? And
Yeah.
hear me? Great, okay. So, I mean, you can carry on because we haven't had questions.
Okay.
We still have some time. So
Great.
please go ahead, yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll just keep going.
Yeah.
Let me do this. So one of the things that I think one of the most, let me put this up. Now I know that this is maybe a little bit difficult to read, but let me just try to explain this.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah.
now we've just had a question, and the question is, how do you define healthy relational connection?
That's a really good question. And it's interesting. When we first started doing this work, we looked out there, and there really were all kinds of psychometrics to look at pathology. But there really weren't a lot of psychometrics to look at healthy connection. So we were excuse me. Sorry. It's allergy season here in the US. We were sort of stuck. We didn't really know how to measure connectedness. So we did a couple little things. One of the first things that we did was that we asked all the kids that came into our clinic to just write down the names of everybody they had a conversation with in the last 24 hours. Who did you talk to, play with, interact with? And what we found was there were kids that would come in and they would write down nothing. They didn't talk to anybody. And then there were kids that had a number of people that they wrote down. And what we found was there's a correlation between the number of people that, that children had talked with and their current symptoms as rated by their teacher and their parent. And so we started to think about how do we do this? How are we going to measure this? And we came up with a really very time-intensive process where we actually had clinicians follow around children observe them in school and after school, and rate the number and the quality of relational interactions that people had. And there was a part of that where we had the child and the other person that they interacted with just give a little bit of a rating. Was that a good interaction? Did you have fun? Or was that negative? So try to get some valence to what that interaction was like. Now that was very time intensive, but it led to a very interesting, again, very powerful findings that were so sad and sobering on one hand. There were some kids that literally the entire time they were followed for 2 weeks, we had a 2-week period we did this, there were they had nobody they interacted with. Many of these kids were in foster care, so they were new to a classroom. They weren't part of a sports team. They had no after-school activities. They were in a foster home with like 6 other foster kids, and they only got paid attention to when they got in trouble. And so they were like invisible, and it was heartbreaking. And so those kids really did poorly. And then we sort of toyed with a very, very intensive sort of metric, and we toyed with sort of a very light touch thing, and we ended up settling on just a very simple thing where, after talking with the child, talking with the teacher, talking with the parents, getting a sense of the child, the clinician would rate whether or not, from 1 to 12, whether or not the child appeared to have decent connections to friends, family, community, culture, and that sort of thing. So our relational health measures got about, I should probably know this. It has like 8 items, and each one of the items you can rate from 1 to 12, and there's anchors and so forth. And that's kind of how we do it, and I'm happy to share that with people that want to know more about it.
Thank you. Yeah, there is another question I can see here. Thank you for all your shared great explanation. I just want to ask, do you also mention how
Attachment?
When you mention connectedness.
Yeah, again, attachment is, part of what our strategy has been with psychometrics is that you can do a very in-depth attachment assessment, and look at all kinds of aspects of how somebody's attached. That tends to be something that is clinically very challenging to do if you've got 90,000 cases like we do. So what we've tried to do is balance sort of deep dive assessment with broad across the board assessment. And there are kids where we see that they clearly have what would be both a history of attachment, be highly plausible they have attachment problems, and then in all their behaviors, it's clear they have attachment problems. And we'll rate that on the brain map, and we take that into consideration on the relational health item. But it's a very tiny component of this broader relational health thing. And in those cases where attachment is a big issue, part of the recommendation following the initial assessment is to do more in-depth assessment about attachment style, capabilities, limitations. And that's kind of what the model is. It's trying to help guide the clinician in their treatment planning, which also means not just what treatments we put in place, but what further assessments do we need so we better understand the child and the family. So attachment is taken into consideration, but it's not measured in any in-depth way like a lot of researchers do that research attachment.
Yeah, there's another question. Now, here it is.
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're keying in on one of the pure dilemmas of working with kids that have early relational trauma. And that is that ultimately, if you have trauma that is either related to emotional abuse or humiliation or relational abandonment early in life, your internal working model about relationships is they're not great. Relationships, I don't trust people. Intimacy scares me and overwhelms me. And the real dilemma that we have as clinicians is that in the end, if we want to really address these problems, the vehicle has to be relationships. And so the very thing that makes them sort of run for the hills, the very thing that they're fearful of and they do poorly at, we have to use. And this is where a lot of clinicians have a hard time, at least in the United States, we have these limitations of time. So they'll tell a poor clinician, they'll say, yes, you have 20 sessions to take this person who has deeply ingrained, problems and make that better. And so there's a tendency for clinicians to push for intimacy faster than they should. And that leads to all kinds of defensive behaviors and people not showing up or people blowing up. And with kids, it's particularly a problem because they don't want to be there anyway. Very few kids call you up and say, hey, doc, I need to come see you in the clinic. Adults have grabbed the kid and said, you come in and see somebody because, because the child thinks they're bad. But so we spend a lot of time working with families and organizations that work with these kids, and we try to have them be parallel, be present, but be parallel, and give the child the opportunity to basically try on intimacy, give them control over the interaction, and that helps tremendously. But the dilemma there is it takes time. And in our medical economic model in the United States, we don't give clinicians adequate time to do this. But so that's a very important point, that a lot of individuals who end up with sort of either personality, they're framed as a personality disorder. I think if you go back and look at individuals who have borderline personality and other kinds of personality issues, narcissistic, the whole range, you can look at their developmental experiences and you see plausible styles of interaction that, once you know their story, you're not that surprised that this is the way they are. But the dilemma we have though in mental health, I think though, is that development is so complex that we need to always try to resist overly simple linear explanations. That there are individuals who had parenting similar to that who didn't end up with the personality disorder that you're looking at. And so this is a really, this is part of the reason we developed this model, is that development is so complex and there's so many variables that in order to really study that adequately, you can't do it with an N of 200 or an N of 400. You need really thousands of pretty well characterized, similarly characterized individuals so that you can then ask some of these questions. And that's why we've tried to get clinicians all over the world to learn this model and use these metrics. And so now our N number is about 90,000. We have about 90,000 cases now on the data set. And it's allowing us to ask some really interesting questions. Anyway, I'm rambling, sorry.
I can see we have 2 more questions, but also time is running as well. Maybe before we end up, only 5 minutes is left. I was just wondering, Dr. Perry, what messages you would like to give to the teachers, because we have many teachers in our audience, and implications for education as the title of your talk.
Sure. I think probably the most important thing that I mentioned or talked about before, and let me just see if I can go back and get us. I think the most important thing that I talked about that's relevant for teachers is that when people feel stressed or distressed or dysregulated, that every single person on the planet will start to lose their capacity to think. So the top part of your brain, the part where you do all your thinking, when you're trying to explain to a child geography or history, or if you're trying to help a child understand the rules of the classroom, the part of the brain that is doing that is the cortex. So for a child to remember that he shouldn't push in line, that he shouldn't poke his friends, that he should learn how to, should basically look before you leap, all of these things that we're trying to teach kids, you have to get to their cortex. But the human brain is constructed, and I didn't really talk about it too much, but the human brain is organized such that you can't go directly to the cortex. Nothing you say, nothing, no word, no touch, no smell, nothing, no sensory input goes directly to the cortex. It has to get filtered through the lower part of the brain and then the middle part of the brain, and then ultimately it gets up to the cortex. So the dilemma for a teacher is that if you don't have a regulated child, if you've got a child who feels hungry, thirsty, cold, scared, angry, anything that you say is going to get short-circuited before it gets to their cortex. And so this is why we talk a lot about regulating strategies for educators. You know, if you use rhythm, if you use sensory regulatory breaks, if you remember that human beings are contagious, right? And that if you're not regulated, you're not going to be able to regulate the kids in your classroom. And so you may need to just take a break and go have a cigarette, take a walk, you know, do whatever is regulating for you before you come back in and try to regulate these kids. And again, for those of you interested in this, we've got some things that we are happy to share. Now, unfortunately, they're in English, but we've got a big part of our community works in educational settings, and the key thing is that everybody defaults to again and again and again and again is this simple sequence of engagement. If you want a child to learn a cognitive concept, if you want to reason with them, you have to first connect with them. They have to feel like they're in connection with you. And in order for that to happen, they've got to be regulated. They don't have to be perfectly regulated, but they have to be regulated to a certain degree. And of course, because human beings are contagious, what that means is you have to be regulated enough to help regulate them, connect with them, and then you can talk with them about whatever it is that you wanted them to learn. So that's the key thing. And that's why I always say the key to the classroom is taking care of the teachers. If you take care of the teachers, everything else will just kind of fall from that. But if you don't take care of the teachers, you could have the best curriculum. You could even have all these sensory regulatory breaks. But if the teacher's dysregulated, if the teacher's not respected, not cared for, not given opportunities for professional development, not supported, those other things that are possibly very, very good in the classroom aren't going to be as effective. In contrast, if you have really bad curriculum and you have all these you don't have opportunities for sensory regulatory things if you have a good teacher who's regulated, that teacher can overcome those problems. So the key, as go the teachers, so go the children.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And we prove that I think we both are very well regulated. What do you think, considering all the challenges?
Well, listen, I would love to do something like this, and I'm happy to do this again, and we can figure out whatever technological things.
Great.
But I appreciate the opportunity, and
thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Very much. Yeah, it has been an honor to have you. And okay, so we'll see you again then. Thank you very
Awesome.
much.
You bet.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody.
Bye, Dr. Perry. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Zorlukları geçtin, yeni evine hoş geldin. Hayatın 4 mevsim, sonbahar bu kez başlangıcı hayallerinin. Kış günü yarının yükü omzunda, ama yalnız değilsin bu yolda. Hazırlan bir çiçek gibi açmaya, kelebek gibi kanatlanıp uçmaya.